Please show me the way, baby, to your heart. Please show me the way, baby, to your heart.
Получится, что подобные меры лишь спровоцируют то, против чего пытаются бороться чиновники. В связи с этим хотелось бы услышать принципиальную позицию правительства в вопросе введения цензурных ограничений в интернете и, если возможно, вашу личную. Спасибо.
Да, интернет – это только инструмент решения важных народно-хозяйственных, социальных проблем. Это возможность общения, возможность самовыражения. Это инструмент повышения и качества жизни, информационной обеспеченности общества. Правда, основные ресурсы находятся не в наших руках, а за бугром, точнее за океаном. И именно это вызывает озабоченность некоторых спецслужб, имея в виду возможность использования этих ресурсов в интересах, противоречащих интересам общества и государства. Но, повторяю, это их озабоченность. Что касается моего личного мнения, как вы спросили, не считаю возможным что-либо ограничивать.
My name, as I said, was Paul Hellyer. I'm a former Minister of National Defence for Canada. I served in 3 governments during a total of 23 and a half years as a Member of Parliament. Although as Minister of National Defence, I had sighting reports of UFOs. I was too busy to be concerned about them at the time because I was trying to unify the Army, Navy and Air Force into a single Canadian Defence Force. And that itself was a kind of battle to the finish. So this was not high on my agenda. But about 10 years ago, I started getting interested due to a young man from Ottawa sending me material on the subject. I told him I was too busy to read it, but he had confidence that someday I would. He sent me a copy of Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. It took me a while to get around to reading it, but I took it for my summer reading in 2005 and was really impressed with what was contained in it. And what I thought to myself is there are huge issues here, huge issues. And the American people and the people of the world have a right to know what's going on because they're part of it. It's not just an isolated thing. And so after confirming the contents of the book with a retired United States Air Force general, I accepted the invitation of Victor Vigiani, who's over here somewhere, and his cohort, Mike Bird, to speak to a symposium at the University of Toronto. And I said, UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. That gave me the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to say so unequivocally. Since then, I've learned a lot from many sources, including a number of the fantastic witnesses that we have heard these last 4 days. They were so outstanding, I was just really blown away with them, the amount of information that was available. And I appreciate every single one of them. But because I'm not a ufologist, I'm a politician, there are only a few things that I want to add in that particular realm. First is that about in the 1960s sometime, it was a flotilla of UFOs headed south that crossed into NATO territory in Europe. And the Commander-in-Chief of the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Europe was naturally very shaken. Fortunately, or maybe divine providence, before the panic button was pushed, the flotilla turned around and headed back north. Obviously, they had thought maybe they were Russian and they were very concerned about it. Anyway, the investigation was launched into this whole subject, and a document was prepared which concluded that at least 4 species had been visiting Earth for thousands of years. And this is my own view at this stage as well. So, except for that, there are just a couple of things that we've talked about that I'd like to refer to. And one was that we were referring to them as they until this morning when Linda Moulton Howe, I think she was the first one, actually named 3 different species. I have brought my latest book called Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, as an aide-memoir, and I name 5 different species here. I'm aware of more now. As a matter of fact, I saw a document just a few days ago that mentioned 20. And I think you, Mr. Chairman, were interested in some of the places they might come from. And I have in here Zeta Reticuli, R-E-T-I-C-U-L-I, Reticuli, the Pleiades, Orion, Andromeda, and the Altair star systems. So I don't think we can any more refer to them as they, because they're not an amorphous mass. They are different species and consequently may have different agendas. I don't think we can say that they all have the same agenda any more than we could say that the United States, China, and Russia had the same agenda. Our real interests may be very similar, but as of now, our perceived interests are still quite far apart. One more observation before I begin what I want to say, and that is that we spent quite a bit of time talking about the 66-year-old cadavers. And I was glad to have Linda this morning finally say that there are live ETs on Earth at this present time, and at least 2 of them probably working with the United States government. The other species that I learned about not too long ago was called the tall whites. And this is when Paula Harris broke the story just a few years ago. And through her good offices, I had the chance to talk for about 3 hours with former Airman Charles Hall and listen to this absolutely fascinating story of how he was working with, first of all, he was scared out of his skin, but after that, when he got to know them, how he was working with, and finally they became to trust each other and have a good working relationship with the tall whites at the gunnery range at Indian Springs in Nevada. And these tall whites were living on United States Air Force property and working in cooperation with the United States Air Force and sharing technology with them. He wrote a book, incidentally, called Millennial Hospitality. There are 4 different versions, but Paula says that Millennial Hospitality number 2 is the best. I think that's the one I read, and it's a very interesting read if you want to sort of get inside the problem of what it's like to bump into these people floating across the terrain in the desert. Well, enough on that for now. My interest is in full disclosure. And my only caveat is I think probably I would say 95 to 98% full disclosure. I know of 1 or 2 things that I'm not sure should be in the public domain, at least yet. They will be someday, I'm sure, but not maybe immediately. But just as children survive the idea of the tooth fairy and Santa Claus when they become adult, I think that tax-paying citizens are quite capable of accepting the new and broader reality that we live in a cosmos teeming with life of various sorts. The fact that some other civilizations are more advanced than we are may be humbling, but that could be a necessary step in our survival.
Thank you very much for being here. My story with regard to the disclosure process is very simple. I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, the site of the first UFO crash, the alleged UFO crash. And my story is as a result of growing up there. I was a senior in high school, just going into my senior year in 1947, when on one day the Roswell Record announced that an alien craft had crashed, and the next day changed that story and said no, the Air Force said that was a weather balloon. And since I was on my way to college and more interested in those things, I didn't pay much attention to it at that point in time. However, my family was in the agribusiness. My grandfather was a cattle buyer and sold registered herds bulls to the ranchers in the area, knew everybody in the area, in the Pecos Valley and beyond. Sold cattle into Arizona, western Texas, and was affectionately known as Bull Mitchell in those parts. And so it was not unsurprising to me later on that the lore of the area, of our friends and the people in Roswell, just including the sheriff's department, and a military friend of ours, a major, who was also turned out to be a friend of Jesse Marcel, who was the first Air Force officer on the site of the crash. And this Air Force officer was in administration. He was not really involved, but he eventually told me his story, and that's how I became involved. So after my Apollo flight, I did very little. I knew nothing but the lore of the region up until that point. But after my Apollo flight, when I was back in the area and visiting relatives and friends, some of the people in the area who had been involved, what I call the old-timers, who were involved in the 1940s, 1947, and subsequent with the Roswell crash, and people like in the sheriff's department who had been to the crash site and were supervising traffic. My friend and friend of our family, the major, who was an office mate of in the administrative function at Walker Air Force Base. These folks, because they had been shushed and told not to talk about their experience by military authority in those days, and on dire consequence if they did, felt that, and here in the 70s, many, many years later, that they didn't want to go to the grave with their story. They wanted to tell somebody reliable. And being a local boy, and having been to the moon, they considered me reliable enough to whisper in my ear their particular story and their association with the Roswell crash, including the family of the undertaker who provided coffins for the alleged alien victims, and others on site who had been involved or knew the story. And of course, eventually I ran into Jesse Marcel Jr., the son of the Jesse Marcel, who was the first military officer on the site, and knew his story, and knew his story well, and we became friends in later years in this disclosure movement. And at some point, about 10 years ago, and I can't remember what date it was right now, when the disclosure movement was going strongly, I came here to Washington with a Navy commander by the name of Will Miller and Dr. Stephen Greer, and we were able to get an appointment at the Pentagon to talk about what we knew, or what we allegedly knew, what we thought we knew, and went and told our story. And the powers that be at the Intelligence Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff listened to our story and said, the Admiral said, well, I don't know that story, I don't know that that's true, but I will find out. So we departed, went on our way, and subsequently learned through Dr. Greer and through Will Miller, and that those stories had been confirmed, and that the Admiral had been denied access when he tried to get into the inner workings of that process. And we had confirmation of that, although the Admiral now denies the fact that this is a fact. So my story is essentially that I have no first-hand experience with the ET effort, except the fact that I know all of these research people that you'll hear from today, and some who are not here today, who have spent a long amount of their lives and time doing research into the alien visitation, UFO crashes, and so forth. And I urge that those who are doubtful read the books, read the lore, and start to understand what has really been going on, because there is no doubt we are being visited. And as a person who is a part of the first generation of being a spacefarer of our civilization and having gone to the moon, and realizing that I do, and many of us do now, that have seen the Hubble pictures from space, the universe that we live in is much more wondrous, exciting, complex, and far-reaching than we were ever able to know up to this point in time. And the fact we have wondered, were we alone in the universe forever? Only in our period do we really have evidence, no, we're not alone. We're just one planet with intelligent life on it, and probably it is time, now that we are spacefarers on our planet, that we get active, because we're really universal beings. And in the long stretch of things, if we think about it in the longest possible range, we realize, and I realize this from my studies in astronomy and astrophysics, our sun will burn out in due course, and we have to be off this planet if our species is to survive. So anybody, any species, any planet that is on around the mainstream star like ours is, only has a finite amount of time on that star before it burns out. And so our destiny, in my opinion, and we might as well get started with it, is become a part of the planetary community of nations, of planets, just like when we were much newer on this planet, and we found tribes over in the next valley or across the next mountain, and we started forming communities then and reaching out beyond ourselves. At this point in human history on this planet, we're now starting, and ready should be, to reach out beyond our planet and beyond our solar system to find out what is really going on out there. And the 20th and 21st century that we now live in, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution really didn't take off until the 19th century. And I tell the story to some of my younger audiences, particularly in schools, that my great-grandparents went across from South Georgia to West Texas in a covered wagon at the end of the Civil War in the 1870s. My family, my father's generation, was involved with going off the planet in aircraft. And less than 100 years later, I went to the moon. So from covered wagons to going to the moon in less than 100 years is the history of the development of our civilization in not our lifetime, but a couple of generations. And so it's time to start thinking in those terms. And particularly since now, in the 20th and 21st century, we suddenly find that due to our expertise and our genius in science and technology, we have exploded our population from under 2 billion at the beginning of the 20th century to over 6.5 billion at this point. And our consumption patterns are clearly indicating that we are utilizing our non-renewable resources at an unacceptable rate, a non-sustainable rate. So we've got a lot of thinking to do about what being an advanced civilization really means. But let's put all that aside for a moment, because we're here to talk about disclosure. And what I am suggesting, it is now time to put away this embargo of truth about the alien presence. And I call upon our government to open up, like other governments have, and you will hear about that this morning, like the Belgians have, the French have, the Brazilians have, the Argentines, the Mexicans have all released their files. It's about time now that we do the same thing and become a part of this planetary community that is now trying to take our proper role as spacefaring civilization. Thank you very much for your time.
Entre mis diversas fuentes de información, la principal ha sido Bob Lazar, el cual trabajó sobre uno de los 9 platillos volantes allí custodiados.
Aterrizamos en Groom Lake. Allí tomé un autobús hacia... No estoy seguro de la distancia, pero unos 25 kilómetros al sur, hasta una zona donde hay un lago salado llamado Papoose Lake. Y justo en la ladera de la montaña se encuentra el área llamada S4.
¿Qué sintió cuando entró allí por primera vez?
Parecía todo muy militar, no un ambiente científico. Había muchos controles, con niveles máximos de seguridad. Se fuera donde se fuera, había que ir acompañado de un guardia armado, incluso al cuarto de baño. Todas las puertas se abrían y se cerraban con una identificación magnética personal. Era un ambiente muy opresivo.
¿Cuántas veces tuvo que entrar en esa zona antes de poder ver el vehículo volador?
Creo que 2 o 3, quizá 2 días antes de poder verlo.
¿Qué sintió la primera vez que vio el objeto?
¿Qué sentí? Bueno, volviendo atrás en el tiempo, la primera vez que vi la astronave fue cuando entré en el hangar y me dije, esto explica por fin todos esos avistamientos de ovnis. Es un vehículo militar secreto en fase de experimentación y ya está. En realidad fue la segunda vez que lo vi, al entrar en su interior, cuando me di cuenta de lo que estaba sucediendo. Es decir, de que se trataba de un vehículo extraterrestre. Obviamente, esto sucedió después de haber leído todo el material informativo. Y entonces, en ese momento cambió todo. Era una sensación distinta, algo inquietante. Me sentía como un intruso. Es algo muy difícil de describir.
Aún así, inténtelo.
Me parecía... ¿Tienes presentes las fotos de Billy Mayer tomadas durante sus avistamientos? Era increíblemente parecido a los discos de sus fotos. Una forma fugaz, pero nítida, de una nave discoidal. Es bastante difícil describirlo así, sin dibujarlo. Pero tenía la típica forma de platillo volante.
¿De un solo tipo o de varios?
En total había 9 platillos. Pero yo trabajé en ingeniería inversa solo con un objeto. Estaban en hangares separados y en cualquier caso eran todos visiblemente distintos.
¿Le dijeron alguna vez cómo habían sido recuperados por el cuerpo de inteligencia de la Marina?
No, en absoluto. La gente ha sugerido varias hipótesis, que habían sido derribados o que habían caído, pero no parecían dañados y por consiguiente tengo serias dudas sobre dichas hipótesis.
¿Nos puede describir el interior?
Es muy simple. Existe un solo color dominante, un gris peltre. El exterior es también de este mismo color. No tiene aristas. En el interior, todo el equipamiento tiene una forma redondeada, incluso los asientos y los espacios para los amplificadores. Es como si hubiesen sido fundidos y luego modelados con estas formas curvilíneas, incluso las uniones entre las paredes y el pavimento. El interior es esencial, muy abierto. El uso del espacio no parece en absoluto funcional. Hay 3 puentes. El más bajo alberga los amplificadores montados sobre bases móviles. En el puente central, desde donde se accede al interior de la nave, están los asientos y los amplificadores. Y luego está el puente superior, un sector limitado al que yo no tenía acceso, no sé qué podía haber allí.
¿En su opinión, el vehículo era extraterrestre?
Absolutamente sí, extraterrestre, no hay duda.
¿Por qué?
En primer lugar, el objeto del proyecto era analizar la nave. Si se hubiera tratado de un aparato de Estados Unidos, no habríamos perdido tiempo en tratar de entender cómo lo habíamos construido. En segundo lugar, por las dimensiones del equipamiento interno, por el tamaño de los asientos y por los materiales utilizados, absolutamente desconocidos para nosotros. Y por último, por el carburante, el elemento 115, que en realidad no existe. Estos datos han de sumarse a las informaciones que me fueron facilitadas, en las cuales se indicaba claramente que se trataba de una nave extraterrestre.
¿Le dijeron cómo funcionaba el sistema de propulsión?
Formaba parte de mi trabajo de ingeniería inversa, es decir, debíamos averiguar el funcionamiento del sistema de propulsión. Habían realizado ya algunos progresos, pero no sé exactamente desde cuándo se encontraba allí la nave, si llevaban 1 o 10 años analizándola. En cualquier caso, con pocos progresos. El sistema es impresionante. Está compuesto por 2 partes, los amplificadores de gravedad y el reactor que proporciona energía. El reactor funciona por aniquilación completa, alimentado por antimateria. La aniquilación completa es prácticamente la más eficaz de las 3 reacciones nucleares que existen, esto es, fusión, fisión y aniquilación. Utiliza un elemento muy pesado, el elemento 115. Esta sería su situación en la tabla periódica. En la Tierra este elemento no ha sido aún sintetizado. En mi opinión, en algunos sistemas estelares, esta síntesis se produce de manera espontánea. El elemento es bombardeado en un acelerador de dimensiones extremadamente reducidas. Como consecuencia de ello, sufre una fisión espontánea y produce partículas de antimateria. Estas, gracias a un dispositivo termoeléctrico con una eficacia del 100%, interactúan con la materia gaseosa y se transforman en electricidad. Ahora bien, la primera ley de termodinámica viene a decir que la eficacia al 100% para cualquier dispositivo eléctrico es bastante imposible, ya que se producen dispersión de calor y otras pérdidas de esta índole. Pero yo, en este sistema, no las detecté.
Declassified U.S. government documents and witness testimony from former or retired U.S. military personnel confirm beyond any doubt the reality of ongoing UFO incursions at nuclear weapons sites. When I say UFO, the witnesses have described these craft as disc-shaped, or cylindrical-shaped, or spherical. These objects are capable of both hovering and high-velocity flight, usually completely silently. Over the past 37 years, I have personally located and interviewed more than 120 of these former or retired military personnel, all of whom report UFO incidents at one or more of the following locations: nuclear missile sites, nuclear weapons storage areas, and nuclear weapons test sites in Nevada and the Pacific during the era of atomic atmospheric testing.
Sometime in the evening hours on March 24th, I received a call from one of my topside guards, the flight security controller, stating that they had been observing strange lights in the sky making odd maneuvers and wanted to report it. I thought it was kind of a strange report, but I took it seriously. You have to understand we were protecting nuclear weapons, and the reports we generally got were very professional. At any rate, I kind of dismissed the call. He called back about 5 minutes later. This time he was screaming into the phone saying they're looking at an object, a red glowing object hovering just above our front gate.
Right above us, there's a huge white thing, pulsating light above us, and I had to call them to make sure I wasn't seeing anything. Upon prodding, he told us it was shaped like a fat cigar. I think he said a pregnant cigar. White pulsating light. Between the pulsations, he saw red and blue lights. It was silent, because I prodded him saying, is it some sort of helicopter? He said, no, it's very silent. We're talking to him for several minutes, and he says it's starting to move away along our access road.
I believe, these gentlemen believe, that this planet is being visited by beings from another world. who, for whatever reason, have taken an interest in the nuclear arms race which began at the end of World War II. Regarding the missile shutdown incidents, my opinion, their opinion, is that whoever are aboard these craft are sending a signal to both Washington and Moscow, among others, that we are playing with fire, that the possession and threatened use of nuclear weapons potentially threatens the human race and the integrity of the planetary.